do not really know each other. I only know two of them. So this will be an opportunity to get to know each other and to talk about the SDGs as our main theme that will connect all of our disciplines. We come from different disciplines, and that's the great thing about this, about the SDGs. So let me share my screen. I will include audio. And then this is the presentation that we prepare for you today, the committee. So the SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals created by the United Nations, and we, as a committee that was formed just because we were interested in creating awareness in our campus about the SDGs, propose a series. You're part of our week 3 series. And we invited Jennifer Bueche to talk about Zero Hunger, which is the goal number 2. Jennifer is a registered dietitian, from the American Dietetic Association. She's a certified dietitian nutritionist in the state of New York, and her specialties are dietary assessment, community, nutrition, and nutrition intervention. Her research interests relate to obesity and relationship to dietary intake, particularly in young children. Her hobbies and other interests are life in a farm, cooking, and gardening. I know Jennifer for some years now. Our first collaboration was with one of my students' creative activity projects, $1 a day. Remember Jennifer, a long time ago? She taught us about food insecurity. Our second speaker is Shahin Kachwala. Her work focuses on the interconnections between gender, violence, and political cultures. Her research interests include transnational and post-colonial feminism, gender and colonialism, nationalism, women's history, and cultural studies, among all. I don't know Shahin yet, and I am happy to have the opportunity to learn more about her today. Then our third speaker is Thor Gibbins, an all-adventure partner, colleague of mine. We have done faculty-led of courses together to Colombia, developed cool partnerships, and we are writing buddies through the Leather Stocking Writing Project, which elevates the professional knowledge, expertise, and leadership capacity of pre-kindergarten through grade 12 public school teachers of all disciplines to engage diverse learners in transformative writing practices, leading students to become critical thinkers, to have greater self-awareness, and to make positive contributions to our communities, local, national, and global. Thor is the founder of this writing group in our campus and the surrounding community of K through 12 teachers. And our last speaker is Dr. Paul Lord. I don't know Lieutenant Colonel Lord yet very well. His professional life is very interesting as a water researcher who evaluates the vitality of mussel populations and develops watershed programs for the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership. He instructs in aquatic pollution, underwater research, marine biology, ecology, biological literacy, and environmental science. He has 30 plus years as a scuba experience as a scuba instructor, and he's a naval retired U.S. Marine. So these are speakers today, and they will answer questions that we prepare for them so they can evolve and develop how they apply the SDGs in whatever they do. These are the Sustainable Development Goals, call for action by all countries, poor, rich, and middle income, to promote prosperity and protecting the planet. And here we have a YouTube video just to remind us what they are. close here and come back to our presentation. So this was put together by the committee, the SDG Awareness Committee, is Rachel Kornhauser, Office of Sustainability, myself trying to make sense of my practice into the SDG goals, Rebecca Harrington from the Office of Health and Education, Denise Lane-Monen, Office of International Education, and Chilton Reynolds, Teaching, Learning and Technology Center and COIL Coordinator. We have two more to come in April 23rd and April 29th. And today, let's begin with our speakers. If you need more information, how to get involved, the committee will be happy to forward you links to get involved. So let me close the presentation and go back to our screen, give you back the screen so we can have our first speaker, Jennifer.
As a registered dietitian, I mean, you can only imagine, I think for me, the issue of undernutrition, malnutrition really propelled me to decide to become a dietitian. I think that's really how my career started. And when I think about just the topic, it really is something that is so embedded in our entire curriculum, because dietitians' goals are to make sure that, again, people have access to healthy food. And I think that's the issue in terms of access. And there's so many things that really impact the issue of being able to attain zero hunger. And I think when you look at the statistics, it's really frightening, especially as you compare the United States to the world. So in this country, we deal primarily with food insecurity, and we see malnutrition more hospitalized induced as compared to in the world where you see malnutrition and undernutrition. And the way that zero hunger kind of intersects all of the other goals is, if you think about the fact that in this country, we're talking about 10% of our population being food insecure. And in the world, about 9% of people, again, who experience hunger. And what's really startling about all of this is the fact that there is enough food in this world to feed the world's population half again. Let me just say that again. There is enough food. It's not a problem of having enough food. What's the problem is the access. So when we're talking about the world, some of the issues have to do with, again, politics and governments and wars and displacement of people. We talk about climate change and drought and flooding and natural disasters. We talk about access and the way that food gets distributed or the lack thereof. We certainly understand how much poverty impacts people's ability to be able to afford food or to be able to get to food. If you contrast that in the United States, we see really more of issues related to poverty and inequities, and this is true in the world as well. And so the idea that not all people are impacted equally, minorities certainly are impacted, particularly Latinos and African Americans, much more so than white Americans. And so, you start to think about what's the bigger issue in the United States. It's food waste. 40% of our food is wasted in this country. How shameful that we are one of the most affluent countries in this world, and yet our diet is sad. And what I mean by that, our standard American diet is sad. The quality of many people's diets in this country is so very poor. If you think about just the minimum amount of fruits and vegetables you're supposed to eat should be closer to 5 at the very least. And most Americans are eating like 2.5 servings. And so we start to begin to think about what we can do about that. And I think, a call to action would be, again, it really has everything to do with policy. And so supporting those federal, national, the national food programs. So I think about SNAP and WIC. I also get very concerned when I see benefits for SNAP that are being allowed to purchase soda and sugared items. I mean, that's not good policy. So we think about that because we want to not just have enough food, but have healthy food. So I think about also sustainable agriculture, expanding the variety of foods instead of just totally relying on rice and corn and wheat and soy, which is making up 60% of our calories. And then if you think about where we live in Otsego County and we think about rural, we have food deserts. And so now I'm seeing dollar stores providing more and more groceries. And if you go in, you see along the whole edge is all of the frozen food items, like your fried chicken wings and your all of that fast food frozen, not of high quality and very inexpensive, cheap canned packaged food. So, I think we have a long way to go. I mean, we think about, the need to promote and support local food banks, soup kitchens. I think about, how important it really is to start at the grassroots level and really be able to provide. But in order to eat healthy and, really consider, it takes some knowledge to do that. I mean, when you have limited monies to be able to stretch and eat a healthful diet, you really have to have some education to be able to do that and do that well. It's much easier to buy a healthy diet when you have more money to spend. So I think in this area, we really could support, I say to people, grow gardens, support community-supported agriculture. There's just a number of interventions. But if we continue to go along the same way, we are not going to meet this goal by 2030. We will not, because the numbers are continuing to climb up for all of the reasons that I mentioned. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jennifer. We can save questions for the end. So Shahin, would you like to continue?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. So I was addressing sort of the questions that were provided to us by the committee. And so the first question obviously was like, how did I become passionate about this topic? And thinking about my work in women's and gender studies, I'm trained in the discipline and I teach about gender inequality in my classes. I talk about gender as a sort of central aspect of our existence. And the fields that I am trained in are devoted to sort of topics around women, gender, feminism, gender arrangements in our society that create sort of different patterns. And because women's and gender studies is obviously also interested in looking at gender as it intersects with the different categories such as race, ethnicity, social class, ability. So I'm always analyzing women and how feminized bodies particularly experience discrimination and oppression. Additionally, there's a sort of really long history of feminist interdisciplinary scholarship on questions of environment as well as sustainability. Women's engagement in sort of environmental movements is well documented, as well as the advocacy by women's groups at the UN level on sustainability and climate change and environmental issues. So I've read all of the scholarship in grad school and been aware of the feminist work, but it was only once I came to Oneonta in 2018 that I started engaging regularly in conversations around sustainability. As a sort of newly minted postdoc, I had more autonomy in structuring my courses, and that's also when I participated in the workshop on sustainability across the curriculum, which was very generative. And finally, my research interests focus, as Maria kindly talked about, on transnational feminism. And I teach a class on this topic as well. And so if we look at sort of the last 4 decades, we see the mobilization for women's rights and gender inequality that has been undertaken by women's organizations across national borders. And this organizing has united people from different countries around this common agenda of fighting for human rights, social justice, as well as sort of analysis of the sort of aspects of globalization, as well as neoliberalism. And so all of these sort of influences and training kind of bring me to thinking about the SDG goal of gender equality, right? And so when we see that how the SDG goal in 2015 was established and the kind of work that went into crafting all of these 17 goals, that's when we see that gender equality comes out as a standalone goal and a central tenet for sustainable development. And I was sort of reading more about it, and it's because the SDGs were created with input and engagement from several feminist organizations around the world. And what all of this, what this goal sort of pushes us to recognize is that gender inequality is created through the interplay of sort of individuals, the social relations we engage in, as well as social and structural factors, right? So the interconnections between the different goals, the UN goals, kind of show us the cross-cutting nature of what gender is and the gendered impacts of our environmental, social, economic concerns. And this is where intersectionality as a lens, which allows us to analyze how vulnerability or inequality plays out across social groups, like also across the social group of what we call it, women. And we see that our gender analysis needs to be multidimensional. The national context and the circumstances need to be understood. So for example, in Nigeria, in Africa, you see in that country that women and girls from the poorest households are nearly 5 times as likely to be married before the age of 18 as those from rich households. In the United States, the share of Black and Indigenous women who live in poverty is twice as high as the share of white women. In India, where I'm from, poor and Dalit women are 2 to 3 times more likely to report that being a woman is a disadvantage. So all of this to say that we cannot just look at gender, the goal of gender equality is separate from the other goals, and there's a clear link between kind of achieving gender equality as well as kind of giving access to education, getting more women to participate. I also just want to quickly mention a couple of critiques of the gender equality goal as it exists and as it has been framed, because what this goal envisions is that women's political participation will lead to gender equality. And yes, that is true, but at the same time, women sort of sitting at the table and the assumption that this gives greater political presence to women will benefit all women is something we need to sort of consider. You know, in India, we've had a woman prime minister, we have a great deal of women participating in the political process, but that does not equate to substantive representation. And the second sort of critique is about, in terms of thinking about economic resources and access, that this economic empowerment needs to also analyze the sort of gendered underpinnings of our economy, that having gender equality is not just about getting economic opportunity between men and women at the same rate, because women do participate in the economic process, but they're overrepresented in sort of the jobs that are undervalued by our society, informal work, the wage gap, the occupational segregation that exists. So we need to sort of recognize that. And while paying attention to the impact on women, we equally need to recognize the impact on men. So when we talk about gender equality, often the language is just focusing on women instead of trying to address sort of more holistically what gender means. There's very little discussion of sexuality, sexual orientation, recognizing individuals from LGBTQ community that also are impacted. So when we talk about gender, it needs to be a more holistic, and it cannot just be a sort of shortcut way of talking about women. So in terms of getting involved, I think first, obviously, sort of naming the problem, recognizing that gender inequality is woven into our social worlds, and patriarchal social structures make invisible this gender order and the differences that are in a sort of hierarchy. And also that there's nothing intrinsic or static about our society, and there's always ways we can challenge kind of our social world and social norms. So I'm gonna end there and look forward to a conversation after all the presenters are done. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahin. So write down your questions. You can even write it in the chat. So Thor, our third presenter.
Unmute. I'm on two screens, so I got something to try to guide me to keep me on track. So as a teacher, I guess the first question is what got me passionate. I got into teaching kind of as later in life and ended up teaching EFL in South Korea for about 3 years, and that's where I decided kind of this concept of being a teacher is something for me, and that's kind of in my kind of years kind of transition towards education. And in my graduate work at Maryland, I started getting guided kind of more by continental philosophers as kind of my research methodology and phenomenology, and really guided by works of Emmanuel Levinas and Hannah Arendt and the idea of the human condition and being plurality, and Levinas's idea of the solicitude of the other. And so being a teacher kind of has to carry this, a teacher has to comport these kind of the caring for being for others as others solicit help from you. So started working in LA at a nonprofit conservation corps where we devoted, our mission was to catch students that were either dropping out or had dropped out of the local public schools in the area, and worked on kind of developing green spaces in the large urban areas of Los Angeles. And then we would also get students to work with the National Park Service. Like, so we went to the Manzanar Historic Park, more Japanese internment camp, and did kind of cleanup work with them there. And now here working in Oneonta and working with kind of composition studies is kind of, I'm developing kind of around place-based writing and kind of using writing as getting students to write about the places that they experience, the places they care about as a means for kind of change or curating or caring about these places in order for them to be sustainable. And so I'm trying to kind of merge kind of place-based writing with kind of critical pedagogy to think of some like critical place-based writing is kind of where I'm going with that. And so this has kind of led me in this last year of kind of made my home as my office and classroom. I've had a lot of time, and then driving around in these kind of rural communities and kind of seeing some of the conditions of these rural communities, kind of like my goal then is kind of the sustaining of equity in education in rural communities. Because as Maria mentioned, I work with pre-K through 12 teachers in a lot of these local rural schools. And so in order to kind of think about education in these rural communities, I think about the three pillars of sustainability, right? Socially, ecologically, economically, in order to kind of there's a term in biology, homeostasis, is that correct? Kind of that. I'm looking at the biologist, the expert for he's, you know. And so that's kind of how I'm thinking about what we can think about schooling in kind of our kind of local areas, because really we're more kind of I want to get people to kind of practice more small d democratic practices, which is more participation in their local communities, and beyond kind of thinking about electoralism that happens every 2 or 4 years. So some of the things that I'm thinking about is, one, combat the narratives that commodify education. I believe in a strong, robust public education system that's equitable for all. And even our public education system is inequitable in that you can, if you have the financial means, you can move to and buy property in a more affluent neighborhood, and you are more likely to get better educational outcomes than if you do not have those means. And so we need to kind of start countering these narratives that kind of think about education as a private resource. And it's not. It can be a public resource and a public good. And so that's kind of one of the first things. And then also, I have these ideas about how we can think about redesigning schools. When I was a teacher in LA, I met an educational architect from Stanford University, and she was explaining to me kind of how spaces can be designed that kind of reimagine kind of learning environments. And so I'm thinking how we could redesign schools away from these, and I'm going to use the word dystopian artifacts of like 19th century industrialization in terms of architecture, in terms of how the times of schooling, which do not make sense in terms of child or adolescent development, and kind of the purpose, and kind of that Paulo Freire talks about kind of the banking model of education, that we just kind of, certain students come in, they take on the same jobs as their parents. And we need to kind of redefine kind of the purpose of what our schools are, especially in kind of rural schools where since the 80s have been kind of consolidated. So schools before like the 80s were kind of the central hubs of activity, of political activity, of community activity. And a lot of these rural communities have kind of lost their schools, or have kind of devalued the schools as the central hub of the community. So I'm thinking broad and big, and I have, it requires a lot of public education policy expertise, but public schools as centers of like community public works projects. I'm seeing since the year in the pandemic, schools as sites as kind of food delivery mechanisms for students that are having a hard time having what Jennifer was talking about, getting access to high quality food. I see schools have a rich opportunity of doing that because they actually do have kind of this kind of hub. And then we also, with COVID and the experience, we do really need to address the infrastructure of the access of high-speed internet in schools and public libraries and Wi-Fi access. I think one of the big disasters is in this last year is students that did not have access to reliable internet have been left behind for over a year now. And some teachers are resorting to like these old models of independent schooling, kind of where you show up once a week at a school and you do some packet work and you turn it in, which it's really kind of more of a didactic type of learning, and it doesn't kind of support kind of modern theories of how people learn, right? Conversations with other people and such. So that's kind of where I'm thinking about sustainability, and so public schools, libraries as sites for community building and mutual aid. So kind of the schools are there, so there's already a site for kind of developing mutual aid networks of kind of food distribution and just skill distribution, and involving kind of the community members more in kind of the schools. So my last little thing is getting kind of the idea of getting involved beyond electoralism. And for teachers, since I work with primarily teachers, we really got to get teachers to advocate for empowering the profession of teaching, and then also advocate and empowering the students, and also empowering the community. So for educators, I'm always trying to get them to search out active local professional learning communities. And like Maria mentioned, We do have one, a local national writing project site here, but there are also some other great kind of local professional learning communities in all parts of New York State and in this country as well. So that's kind of where my thoughts are for the last. I've been spending a year thinking a lot of these ideas, so it's kind of nice to try to start consolidating them.
Thank you, Thor. And we have Paul last.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Yeah, my name is Paul Lord. I teach wet biology and ecology, and the source of my enthusiasm for this goes right back to my childhood. I've recently read that if you want to be happy in life, you need to look at what you were enthralled with when you were 8 to 10 years of age. And it certainly works for me. And I took a long, circuitous route to come back to this. But putting my face in the water has always been something of a stress reliever and provided me an opportunity to be fascinated by the diversity of life, no matter where those waters have been, at least until I started spending a little bit more time in really polluted waters. So waters are really my focus, and everyone should know a basic tenet of ecology is that all environments are interconnected, but water demands connection. Water literally flows downhill, and streams form rivers, and they flow into lakes, lakes flow into rivers, and it all ends up in the ocean. As an undergraduate, I was told in a limnology class that the solution to pollution was dilution. And boy, have we learned that that is ever wrong. We have learned that that is wrong. Because now we find that our waste products are spread all around the globe and with deleterious effects for humans who consume products out of the ocean and for marine mammals that are similarly consuming products out of the ocean. I mean, quite simply, you're working on a car or around the house and something spills on the driveway and it rolls down and there is a storm sewer in the cul-de-sac, and that material starts a journey out into the deep ocean, touching everything as it goes, impacting life in every part of that pathway. And it isn't just by the terrestrial environment, it's also, of course, through the atmosphere. Everything that we are burning in terms of fossil fuels puts various nutrients and certainly carbon dioxide high into the atmosphere, only to be washed down into the ocean. The ocean is doing the major work in trying to clean up our mess of carbon dioxide and methane. And yet the ocean itself is being severely impacted by that right now, by acidification, the warming. So acidification is impacting shelled animals. The warming of the ocean is deadening currents that bring nutrients up from the deep ocean so that life can proliferate in shallow waters. Of course, no discussion of the ocean's sustainability would be complete without at least an acknowledgement that we have to take what we take from the ocean, both for eating, but also for things like concrete creation, special metals, mining from the deep floor. We have to take what we take from the ocean in a sustainable fashion, and frankly, those guidelines for sustainable harvest of too many species and too many other products from the ocean are not well understood enough for us to reasonably create guidelines and regulation. I tell my students that there are three main issues with sustainability and human impact on the oceans. So the first is climate change. I've already addressed that. And then the second is nutrient pollution. And our focus on those handful of grains that Jennifer identified that make up such a ridiculous proportion of our diet, we are engaged in industrial agriculture and using a early 20th century technology to pull nitrogen out of the air and then just spew it all over our soils, where it is then washed away downstream through rivers and streams, through drain tiles in formerly wetland areas. And it appears to have no impact, because in fresh water, those nitrogen nutrients are not the limiting resource. And so we don't see the waters turning green until that nitrogen-laden fresh water hits the salt water and mixes with it. And then we have ridiculous blooms that just by nighttime respiration suck all the oxygen out of those areas, killing advanced forms of life and leaving nothing but jellyfish and algal blooms in vast areas of our ocean right now. So we need to learn to harvest sustainably. There are plenty of folks who are doing evaluations on what is sustainable and what's not. And the problem is that a particular species or a product might be sustainable if harvested in one place or by one technique that isn't sustainable other places. If you're not going to be constantly checking your electronics to figure out what the latest judgment is on the sustainability of a particular product, let me offer you this. We can aquaculture marine bivalves, and we can do that widely around the world, and we can harvest those sustainably. So those are generally always sustainable. Our Atlantic Ocean lobster is an eminently sustainably harvested resource, the way it is harvested in Maine in particular, but also in the Canadian provinces right now. That is something that we should be paying more for and using more frequently as fresh food, since we can enjoy it as fresh food where we live, as opposed to other people who can only enjoy it as frozen commodity. And then we should be focused more on using the really small fishes and those jellyfish that I talked about, because the anchovies and the jellyfish of the oceans are still there in great numbers and are not valued, but they are good protein sources, and we need more protein in the diets of so many people around the world. What we can be doing other than focusing on the sustainable harvest, we need to be thinking all the time about our water products. Given the fact that the waters are all interconnected, we need to be sure that whatever water we're disposing of, from our agricultural waste, from our electric generation, from our human wastewater, all of those waters need to be cleaned with technologies that exist right now, and when used in bulk are not that expensive, but of course they are more expensive than the technologies that are employed right now. We need to be cleaning those waters up before we allow them to escape our control after we've used them. We need to go to the oceans with a sense of wonder and a responsibility for modeling sustainable behavior all the time. We need to be stewards of the ocean. We need to learn more about what's going on in the ocean and demand answers for the questions that are still left unanswered so that we can better manage the vast resources of the ocean that are not the property of one government, one country, one people. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about my passion.
Thank you, Dr. Lord. Very nice presentations. I think we all connect. So let's see if we have some questions, how to elaborate more on what each of our speakers have said. Sorry, I was muted. This happens all the time. So thank you for your presentations. I think all of you are making connections between all the goals that you were talking about. I think we are all responsible, and in whatever practice we do, we affect another human being, another species, another behavior. So I posted a first question just to start the conversation for Jennifer, and I have more for each speaker, but I would like to hear from the people attending, and if they have specifics that you would like the speakers to elaborate further.
Okay, I see the first question, and it looks like it's for me, about dealing with the big impact of the food industry while educating our young kids to eat healthy. You know, I think certainly as a parent, I think it's really important to really limit the amount of screen time. I think it's really important to take your children to the grocery store and educate them about how to pick out healthy foods and start with the produce section first. I think getting your children involved in cooking and being a part of the conversation about what their favorite foods are and what they would like to make. I mean, I think that that's so important. And I think just really being an advocate for our children. I know certainly that the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has come under a great deal of scrutiny because when we have our food nutrition conference and exhibition, right, we have the big companies like Coca-Cola and Pepsi, and quite frankly, when you're the Coca-Cola company, but you also have water, right? That's one of your and you have unsweetened beverages, right? You can promote that you have alternatives or healthier options, quite frankly, which again is a very fine line to walk and a scary place to be. And I think it's just, the consumer science and the public interest is a really kind of fun newsletter to read. I think about that approach to being able to really, with a good lens, be able to get past all the hype and the misinformation and the profit making to be able to get to the truth of being able to make good decisions about what it is that you're buying. Things like buying things with 5 or less ingredients. If you can't pronounce it, really kind of start to question, but eating more from the perimeter of the grocery store. But I think it's just really important to know where your food comes from, to make sure your children do, to know and have them be a part of it and the decisions about the groceries that you buy in your home. I think that's really important, making them good stewards. Can
I add in what Jennifer's saying, since this connects to by public education and schools as sites for this? I think schools can be sites of community gardens as programs for farm to table programs. I think Sydney Elementary School has a hydroponic system where they grow their own greens. I think lettuce and arugula, and they also have a tilapia the fish tilapia farm there.
Tilapia.
And they have a community and they have a garden project out there, so the
How
kids
cool
go
is
out
that?
and do community garden, and they really, I think we need to like highlight that and showcase that more and kind of get other schools to be involved, especially in rural schools where we have these kind of wonderful green spaces, and we can really educate our students around kind of the importance of food and eating healthy foods, and help probably solve the food desert problem that's going on in some of these communities around us.
I see Maria posted a question for me about in terms of the learned behaviors, right, which are connected to our cultural identity, that are obviously connected to our families. And I think the first sort of aspect is to recognize that there is nothing inherent about our genitalia that connects to our gender identity. So sort of deconstructing the socially constructed nature of this behavior, recognizing the role that age and the age hierarchy between parents and children also play a role. So this idea, when we sort of talk about a patriarchal social structure, that it's always just we are discussing sort of men's behavior or the power that men have, but also understanding that a lot of this training that we get, if we are lucky enough to have two parents, that our mothers sometimes teach us all of these things. I know that that's something I had to kind of unlearn many of these sort of taught behaviors. And so I think it's difficult to just sort of change, but when we don't recognize that the patterns we are following and the power hierarchies that are inbuilt in our relationships, even if they are affective bonds between parents, this is why sort of intimate partner violence is something we discuss extensively in my classes, that it isn't, we need to understand how power plays a role in our relationships with each other, and that how we learn about power, right? So dismantling what is masculinity, the kinds of rewards that certain behaviors get from individuals as well as socially, recognizing that sort of is a step towards challenging the inequalities that exist. So that's sort of my
being a Colombian woman and having raised under Catholicism, patriarchal kind of society, it has been very difficult for my own. And then becoming educated is like I'm going against my identity, the expectations of my community, and I have mentioned that several times as being an educated woman, I feel discriminated because people don't trust educated women. Because when I don't have equal conversations with educated men because of my gender. So that is on me. And at some point I feel defeated. I feel like I just need to go with the flow and maybe teach my daughter to do better later on as she's younger and will face another type of life or reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I want to give the other speakers a chance to talk, but I think it's really so ingrained. Like just yesterday, we were talking about gender-based violence in my class, and one of the things we were deconstructing was the messages as young children get, that if you are a girl child that is being pushed around on the playground, often you have adults who tell you that the reason this boy is hitting you is because he doesn't know he actually likes you, and that's why he's pulling your hair or pushing you down in the ground. And that is such a terrible message to give to young people, because then we are teaching them that this is how you, one, that, our young boys don't have sort of an emotional intelligence and they're not able to express themselves. And second, that women recognize that this is how somebody expresses that they like you. So yeah, it's really convoluted, but kind of the first step is recognition, and that it's a continuous process, right? That it's not something that you just suddenly stop being conscious of it forever. So.
Okay, Thor, I posted a question for you, and I think Greg also posted comment and questions for all of you.
As everyone was speaking, I kept having Greg's question in the back of my head about kind of global capitalism and kind of, the exploitation of the global South and kind of how our United States is kind of a primarily consumer country that kind of is the engine that keeps churning this global capital market. So and all the things we're talking about are kind of the effects of that, I think. So yeah, that's always in the back of my head. And for transforming education, I think Shahin probably can answer this question better, because she talks about women being overrepresented in education and probably why their teachers have been disempowered for maybe the last 50 years, 60 years. And kind of what the pandemic has kind of brought is, one, teachers are exhausted, but also the political stakeholders in trying to force teachers back to face-to-face when it hasn't been clearly safe, has kind of shown how disempowered teachers are in kind of having a say in how they teach or educate children. And I think one thing I'm looking, like I always I'm a big fan of democracy, and I really want to kind of democratize the local public schools where teachers have more kind of a robust say in how the curriculum is developed, rather than a top-down, more of a kind of democratic kind of, I imagine if we could have schools like worker co-ops, if that makes sense. That's how I would love to kind of imagine that, but I doubt that might happen in the next 15 to 20 years. I can, cross my fingers. So that, but also with just getting teachers, my work is kind of to really kind of see that they can kind of advocate for their profession through ways of like writing and kind of engaging in the community and kind of doing kind of this place-based kind of community research projects so that we get them involved in that. I think that might help empower and transform teachers. So that's my question, and I'll let the next question go.
So Paul, there is a question about how do we really eat jellyfish? How do we eat jellyfish?
Yeah, I thought that I could answer that best in chat, so I started that. But let me simply say that jellyfish are an amazing food in that they're very high protein. They have no objectionable taste at all. When I feed them to my students in marine biology, I think the best description I've heard from a student was crunchy water. And so you can, all you do is you take the salted jellyfish, flood them, change the water once or twice, depending on how much salt you want in your final product. I mean, if you're using a little bit of jellyfish in a big product that doesn't have any salt, you probably don't even have to clean the salt out of them. And because they have no taste whatsoever, they are just a great addition to a wide variety of cultural foods. We really need to learn to eat more jellyfish, since we're doing such a good job of growing them with all of the nitrogen waste that we send down the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico every year. It's about the only thing that grows in that huge dead zone that's hundreds of square miles that occurs every July and August in the Gulf of Mexico, offshore from the Mississippi outflow.
So I'm wondering if what do you think about including marine biology early in elementary education? Do we have marine biology courses in elementary education, or nutrition courses in elementary education?
Not as much as we need. I think with the heavy emphasis on standardized testing, with focusing on reading and math as kind of the essential kind of skills that to promote students with, we've kind of lost this kind of holistic kind of way we can educate students in all these disciplines, and like it saddens me because I think I would love my daughter to have in second grade a marine biology class or a nutrition class.
Well, I think that the cafeteria can be a great learning laboratory for students, right? But the challenge is that the school meal program is also deeply entrenched with the USDA because of commodity foods. And so when you look at the commodity foods that are being distributed to the schools, hello, I mean, there's some real challenges with what they're actually sending, although it's gotten somewhat better. But then you also, in terms of cafeteria managers, they work very, very hard, but they don't always have all of the skills that they need to be able to put a menu together and then to get the kids to eat it, right? So, chicken tender day, they're out the door. But if you're serving, something that's maybe a little bit less fast food or a little fresher, then they're less likely to, try something. I think it's just a challenge. I think we need to keep exposing children to different and new and variety of foods and do it in a fun way. Cooking demonstrations, all that. Community gardens, I think would be wonderful.
I think they do that at Sydney, right?
Yes.
They do little cooking demos with the food that the kids grow.
Yes.
So we can do it because they're actually doing it right down the road.
Absolutely. It just needs to be consistent. We're starting to see more and more school districts hiring a dietitian to work with teachers, to work with cafeteria, kind of make it all, really a combined effort.
Yeah, less siloed.
No, ketchup is not a vegetable anymore.
And maybe apply for grants to take all kids to the ocean early. Everyone needs to meet the ocean. Okay, we need to be respectful. People's time is time to go. But if any of the speakers have a last thought of how to integrate the SDGs in a better world, in sustaining our life on Earth, and any of the audience would like to add something last.
So I just want to quickly address Greg's question about capitalism. And a lot of feminist economists sort of talk about how sustainable development at one level is an oxymoron. And we really have to rethink sort of our economic models. Without kind of questioning that model, we will really not have sustainability. And so any sort of model that still relies just on the GDP, sort of growth, economic growth as an indicator, doesn't also dismantle the inequalities between the global north and the global south. So I think that's sort of the real challenge, and recognizing some of the issues with the sustainable development goals, I think is also really important, because these are sort of really significant, and they're so broad, but at the same time, do they include enough language about how to implement these changes? And I think that's still sort of a question. So that's all.
Anyone else? Thank you for being here today. Thank you for being part of this conversation. We welcome you to come back to our last two. And this is a great space for faculty. We can share what we do, our passion, and how are we contributing to the world, which is our important mission here, to survive together. Thank you very much. Thank you for attending.
Take care.
Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thank you, Maria. It was nice.